Upon the accession of Nicholas II in 1894, the Russian Empire was at its height. Spanning 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, it covered territory from Central Europe all the way to the Far East. Here, between the desolate shores of the Sea of Japan and borders of the decaying Chinese Empire, Russian statesmen expected to embark on their next era of expansion. Yet at the dawn of the 20th century, Siberia and the Far East were disconnected and undeveloped parts of the Tsar's dominions. There was little to link them directly with the more populous European Russia west of the Urals. The only major port in the region was Vladivostok, which had been the focal point of the Tsar's naval power since 1871, but in this period it was little more than an overlarge fishing village. Worse, it froze for part of the year, requiring large icebreakers to keep it in operation, and many Russian ships to seek safe haven further south in foreign ports, such as those of Japan. The solution to all of these problems was to be engineered by the most forceful Russian politician of the age. Before 1905, the Russian Empire had no prime minister. All ministries reported directly to the Tsar, who was theoretically supposed to coordinate their policies. But Nicholas II was not that monarch. Young and untrained, he was undoubtedly hard-working, took care to read his briefings and attempted to understand the many complex issues that faced him as best he could. But he had a hard time saying no to people and a tendency to change his mind depending on who spoke to him last. In this gap, the talented, energetic and overbearing finance minister, Sergei Witte, was able to rapidly assert himself. Witte had been brought into government by Nicholas's father, Alexander III, in 1892, and throughout the decade had overseen a series of major economic reforms, the most significant being the introduction of a punitive tariff structure, the adoption of the gold standard, and borrowing abroad to try and fund industrialisation. The results were extremely questionable, for after a short-term boost, they were ultimately to lead to a deep recession at the turn of the century. But for the time being, they allowed Witte to project an aura of hyper-competence and invincibility within government, which gave him a lot of leeway to pursue his true obsessions, railways and the Far East. Witte believed Russia's future was in Asia, that the railways he was building would accelerate Russian colonisation of the Far East, and that colonisation, in turn, would open the door to commercial dominance of the region. And the finance minister was not alone in this vision. In late 1891, a committee had been set up to consider the possibility of a trans-Siberian railway to connect western Russia to eastern. This was a massive scheme, particularly for an undeveloped, undercapitalised and still largely agrarian country like Russia. Yet the proposal commanded support among several policymakers for a range of reasons. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, it was a matter of prestige. Railways were, after all, something great powers built, weren't they? In that case, Russia should probably have some too. Evidence that the Tsar's autocracy could construct on the scale of either the British Empire or United States. But there were also practical benefits. The tract would connect the vast western and eastern extremities of the empire together, helping prevent any political rupture between the 100 million Russians west of the Urals and few hundred bears and exiled communists in the east. Witte had not been the architect of the Trans-Siberian to begin with, but he soon became almost synonymous with it, raising the funds and pushing through the policies needed to implement the design. Once the decision had been made, the railway was built quickly and expensively. It was single track, ordered to minimum standards, and the results often showed. The most serious structural problem was Lake Baikal, which sat squarely across the route. Until 1904, when a path was blown around the lake's edge, trains would have to be put on a ferry and shipped across, leaving a horrendous bottleneck in the journey. Witte had originally hoped that the railway would become commercially viable relatively quickly, but the returns were slow to materialise. Siberia remained too sparsely populated, its resource base too poorly understood to generate significant attention. This reality pushed Witte's ambitions southward. If the railway could not yet pay for itself through Siberia alone, perhaps it could serve as the instrument of Russian economic penetration into China. The opportunity to expand on this scheme came almost immediately. In spring 1894, a popular uprising destabilised Korea, traditionally a tributary kingdom of China's. The Chinese decided to send an expeditionary force to restore order, bringing them into direct conflict with the rising power of Japan. Since the country had been opened to the West in 1853, Japan had been put through a rapid series of modernising reforms, investing heavily in its military. At the turn of the century, it was prepared to strike out in its own bid for empire. Tokyo thus dispatched its own reinforcements. By the 20th of July, China and Japan were at war. The Japanese quickly won command of the seas and on the 23rd of July took the royal palace of Seoul, crowning their success with a victory at the Battle of Asan a few days later. By October, the Chinese had been driven out of Korea completely, allowing Japan to formalise its occupation through an alliance with the newly conquered kingdom. Japanese successes continued. By spring 1895, the empire occupied a significant amount of territory throughout Asia and was preparing to conquer Taiwan. On the 17th of April, after much wrangling, China accepted the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Peking was to cede a large chunk of territory, most importantly the Liaotung Peninsula, which included the base for China's northern fleet, Lashun, soon to be Port Arthur. Wary of Russia's interests, as we shall see, the Japanese were, however, quick to declare they would recognise Korean independence in the lead-up to peace, even if they would undoubtedly continue to maintain overwhelming influence in the country. This remarkable change in the Pacific's balance of power was watched with interest by all of the great empires, but the Russian government felt it was set to lose most with Japan's sudden rise. On the 9th of August 1894, when the war was in its infancy, the Foreign Minister, Gear, had chaired an interministerial commission to discuss the situation. Gear argued that Russia's main interest was maintaining the pre-war status quo and independence of Korea. He was particularly concerned that if Japan were to occupy the peninsula, Russia would be faced with a second Bosphorus. That is to say, Russian trade and her Far Eastern fleet would be bottled up and dependent on the neutrality and benevolence of Japan, as it was dependent on the Ottoman Empire for passage through the Turkish Straits back in Europe. Russia, the Council agreed, should thus aim to preserve Korean independence through diplomatic means, ideally in cooperation with the other great powers. For the time being, that generally just meant waiting for events to play out. Because this was boring, both Alexander III and Gear took the opportunity to die. By the time Nicholas II had completed his mandatory onboarding, Japan was well on its way to victory. Russia was thus left with a choice. It could either seek an accommodation with Tokyo based on the settlement it had agreed with China and learn to live with this rising power, or contest it. She chose the latter. At a meeting of the Special Committee on the 11th of April 1895, the new Russian Foreign Minister, Lobanov, concluded that Japan's acquisition of the Liaotung Peninsula was a threat to both China and Korea's independence. Witte also forcefully argued that Japan's conquests here would suffocate Russian interests in the region. He suspected that the Japanese territorial appetite would by no means be satiated with these gains, and their future expansion would be a constant menace to Russian commercial and political interests in China. On the other hand, if Russia were to support the Chinese instead, they would earn their gratitude and thus smooth the way for the peaceful economic penetration of the country that Witte so desired. Thus, Russia proposed an intervention by the European powers to moderate Japanese gains. The basic idea had actually originated in London rather than St Petersburg in October 1894, when the British suggested a coalition to diplomatically intervene on China's behalf. At that point, nobody had been interested. The Russians distrusted the British, and the Germans had no desire to get in the middle of a squabble between the two. But by April 1895, the mood had changed. This time, the Germans quickly became willing participants. Berlin was not, of course, a formal Russian ally, having refused to renew the reinsurance treaty in 1890, but the Kaiser still wished for good relations with the Tsar, and there were ulterior reasons for German interest in the region. First and foremost was the Kaiser's own tendency to blather on about the Yellow Peril, and Japan's victories had convinced him of these views. More importantly, from the perspective of the German national interests, Berlin had no pre-existing territorial base near China, and the Germans were thus naturally willing to support an initiative that may give them an outlet from which they could exert political and commercial power. In a letter to the Tsar in April 1895, the Kaiser expressed his willingness to support Russian advancement in the area in return for a German port. Specifically, Wilhelm noted on one of his memos, Taiwan would have been ideal. Finally, the Germans were all too happy to see Russian imperialism focused on the Far East rather than Europe, provided they were not denied their own piece of the pie. The third power to sign up was France, Russia's formal ally since 1891. In contrast to Berlin, Paris was far more reluctant to join any intervention to limit Japanese gains. There was not much that France really wanted from the region, and it was difficult to see what Paris gained from risking Japan's wrath. Yet France had only just won the Russian alliance. She was not about to allow Germany and Russia to kiss and make up without her. Britain was also invited to partake, but the intervention of 1895 was a different kettle of fish to London's own proposal 6 months earlier. British policy was to avert any partition of China, which Whitehall thought Russia's new proposal seemed likely to proceed. The British thus declined to join what was to become known as the Triple Intervention, inadvertently paving the way for their future friendship with Japan. On the 23rd of April 1895, identical notes were handed to the Japanese recommending changes to their peace treaty with China. Tokyo was in little position to fight. True, the Drybun's land forces posed no real threat. Russia had just 30,000 troops in the Far East against Japan's 70,000 in Korea and southern Manchuria. But the naval equation was a different story. Again, it's true that the German navy was unimpressive at this point, and it was doubtful that France would commit its naval forces in any strength if push came to shove, but Russia, the ringleader of the group, had a decent advantage in the Pacific, consisting of the battleship Nikolai I, 3 armoured cruisers and 3 non-armoured cruisers. Furthermore, this could be reinforced by her European squadrons if necessary. The Japanese navy, by contrast, consisted of 4 antiquated small battleships, 1 small armoured cruiser, and 8 protected cruisers. Not totally insurmountable odds, but enough to be daunting to the already war-weary Japanese. If the Drybund won control of the seas, as would have been likely, they could cut the overstretched Japanese army off and fund the Chinese to mop it up. There was thus little the Japanese could do. They declared they would renounce all but 1/8 of the Liaotung Peninsula, effectively foregoing everything except Port Arthur. They were told that even this was unacceptable, and the Drybund began military preparations in response. On the 4th of May, Tokyo decided to capitulate and concede the entire peninsula. There followed another 6 months of negotiations, theoretically between the Chinese and Japanese, though in reality with constant meddling from the Russians. In return for being stripped of her major spoils, Japan was allowed to take a few territorial compensations, such as Taiwan. Most importantly, she would also gain a large indemnity from China, an indemnity that was to go a long way to financing her military build-up over the next decade. For now though, Russia had in the short term won a significant triumph without fighting. In the long term, of course, it was something of a hollow victory. Russia had infuriated the Japanese but not crippled them, nor was Russia ever going to have anything like so favourable diplomatic circumstances again. An isolated and financially exhausted Japan facing a Russia supported by 2 European allies prepared to follow her lead. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Russia missed a chance to permanently hamstring the Japanese threat with the Triple Intervention. Bluntly, she should have pushed her luck, demanded the cancellation of the indemnity, given Taiwan to Germany, and taken Korea as a protectorate in return when the opportunity arose over the following year. From there, the military could have had its pick of warm water Korean ports and maintained Chinese goodwill. The British might have grumbled, but they'd already made it clear they were not going to get involved, and there was not much they could have done anyway against France, Germany and Russia united. As it was, Russia had to make do with a limited victory in 1895. Even so, Tokyo had been sent packing, and perhaps more importantly, Peking was overwhelmingly grateful to the Russians for saving her from the worst of the Japanese terms. The Chinese became even more indebted in June 1895, when Russia gave them a major loan to pay off the first part of the indemnity. Almost immediately, Russia began looking to cash in her goodwill with the Chinese by shortening the Trans-Siberian Railway, pushing it through rather than around northern Manchuria. The policy caused a major squabble between Witte and the Foreign Ministry, which disliked running such a vital artery of Russia's Far Eastern position through another country's territory. Witte, however, was then at the height of his power and the Tsar supported him. On the 30th of April 1896, the Russian minister at Peking, Count Cassini, gave the Chinese proposals for a trans-Manchurian railway, arguing it would allow Russia to protect China from Japan. Peking, though, was not entirely certain Russia's intentions were honourable. Whilst allowing a bear into one's house could be a useful deterrent, persuading a bear to eventually leave said house was a more difficult prospect. The Chinese proved surprisingly and annoyingly stubborn in St Petersburg's view for a country that had just had its chestnuts pulled out of the fire by Russia, but under significant pressure they finally capitulated on the 16th of May. Even more promisingly for Sino-Russian relations, in 1896 the eminent Chinese statesman Li Hungchang in St Petersburg for Nicholas II's coronation signed a secret alliance with Russia, allegedly to maintain China's integrity against any further Japanese expansionism. In return, Russia would be able to construct a railway through to Vladivostok, and its ships would be able to use Chinese ports in wartime and emergencies. The alliance was ratified on the 28th of September, though probably not widely known about even within the Chinese government. Nish, for example, recounts an anecdote that when some years later the Russians insisted that the 1896 agreement gave them exclusive rights to manage a custom house in Delny, a local official lamented, "The way seems blocked at every turn by some secret treaty with Russia, of which no one, not even the highest officials of the empire, has any knowledge." The bear was apparently making itself a bit too comfortable. The Triple Intervention and its aftermath had thus meant that by the end of 1896, northern China, and to a large extent the Chinese government, was increasingly under the Russian Empire's thumb, and over the following months Korea looked to be going the same way. Although Korean independence had been recognised by the Treaty of Shimonoseki, Japan was able to emerge from the war with overwhelming influence in the country. But her control was resented and opposed by an anti-Japanese faction centred around the powerful Korean Queen Min. In October 1895, the royal palace was infiltrated by Japanese agents who butchered her in a really grisly murder. The king took the seals of office and fled to the Russian legation for refuge. From there he began a strongly anti-Japanese course, dismissing their sympathisers in the government and military and granting the Russians an endless string of concessions in turn. Had the Russians taken the opportunity during the Triple Intervention to cancel the Chinese indemnity, and so truly crippled the Japanese, there would have been little to stop her taking Korea as a protectorate in the near future. As it was, Japan remained a force to be reckoned with, having already begun a major expansion of both the navy and army. Not that this meant much to Tokyo in 1896, with its influence in Korea evaporating rapidly. The Japanese retreated to calling for the terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki to be respected, that is to say, complete Korean independence. Although the Russian minister in Korea, Weber, was prepared to accommodate this, signing an agreement on the 9th of June 1896 that appeared to recognise equal rights for both empires in Korea, in St Petersburg opinion was less amenable. Russia would not force the Korean king, who wished to remain at their legation indefinitely, to return to his palace like the Japanese wanted. When he did so a year later, in February 1897, it was at the insistence of anti-Russian Koreans themselves, not St Petersburg or Tokyo. Nor would Russia remove the military advisors that were arriving in July 1897 to train the Korean army. Thus, whilst the Yamagata-Lobanov Agreement in principle established equal rights in Korea, in reality Russia remained in the driver's seat. Soon after, St Petersburg offered to recognise the Korean king as emperor in return for only employing Russian advisors. Korea's finances were then put under Russian control. There might have been a window at this point to acquire the long sought after warm water port on the Korean coast. But this would have been a major concession, and one Witte, insistent on peaceful penetration, would have opposed. Russian policy was to be hampered in the Far East by the death of Lobanov in August 1896. His successor, Muraviev, had none of his predecessor's authority and little direct knowledge of East Asia. Still, in 1897, Russia seemed ascendant in the Far East. Korea was quickly becoming a protectorate in all but name, and China likewise remained a firm ally. All of that, though, was about to unravel. In August 1897, Wilhelm II met his cousin Nicholas in St Petersburg. The atmosphere was a cordial one, but the Kaiser, who had a tendency to fling one grandiose scheme after another at the wall to see what stuck, came away under the impression the Tsar had supported his suggestion that Germany should acquire the port of Kyoto. The Germans had long sought a naval base in China to facilitate greater trade and power projection in the region, and had been disappointed not to receive one from the Triple Intervention. Thus, believing Russia would at least not oppose the move, on the 14th of November a German squadron entered the port. The Russians were in fact furious, for China would inevitably try to hold them to their commitment to maintain her territorial integrity. Hoping to counter the German move and draw Russia into the squabble, Lee offered St Petersburg the opportunity to temporarily occupy a Chinese port in return. Theoretically, he had chosen his bait well. As we have already discussed, Vladivostok was not ideal as far as naval bases go. Icebound throughout the winter, it was also considered too far away from likely operational theatres against Japan by the Navy. What the Russians really wanted was a warm water port of their own. Lee calculated that once the Russians established themselves, they would surely oppose a rival great power in the area. After the Germans were dealt with, some fair arrangement could surely be found with the Russians. Muraviev accepted Lee's suggestion and chose Port Arthur, but it was to be an awful mistake, for despite his anger with the Germans, the foreign minister had no intention of upholding his end of the bargain and openly opposing their acquisition of Kyoto. With no Russian support forthcoming, the Chinese therefore had no choice but to concede a 99-year lease to Germany on the 6th of March 1898. Even more unfortunately for Lee, when it came to the occupation of Port Arthur, Muraviev mistook the word temporarily for permanently. Dreadful what gets lost in translation. Muraviev thus asked, or perhaps more correctly demanded, that a similar arrangement be granted to Russia with Port Arthur. On the 27th of March, the Chinese reluctantly agreed and offered Russia a 25-year lease on the harbours of Port Arthur and Dalny, though few doubted this would be extended when the time came. The former was to be an exclusively naval port for Russian use only, whereas the latter would be a trading port. An additional agreement on the 7th of May marked out the boundaries of the lease. Russia was also to extend her Manchurian railway down to Port Arthur and be given exclusive privileges in the region. Russia then had secured the bare necessity of a warm water port, yet it had come at a terrible price. The Chinese felt used and betrayed. They could hardly have expected Russia to act as protector out of the goodness of her heart, but they had apparently not expected her to behave so rapaciously so quickly. What's all the more incredible about this expansion is that it was viciously opposed within the government itself. Witte thought taking Port Arthur would make a mockery of Russia's pledge to uphold Chinese territorial integrity against Japan. Admiral Tirtov, director of the Naval Ministry, was likewise doubtful as to Port Arthur's use for the Pacific Squadron. The internal harbour was too small to accommodate a large squadron, and it had just one narrow exit, which could only be used by large vessels at high tide. Tirtov would have preferred a Korean port. Makarov, the greatest Russian admiral of the era, suggested Pusan. In a report for the Naval Ministry, he argued this would be the best port for contesting any Japanese landing in Korea and conducting operations against them. Granted, the political situation in Korea was not yet favourable to such a major concession, but it was hardly favourable in China either, and losing the Chinese alliance over something so frankly trivial was far worse. Even if they had no intention of contesting the German acquisition of Kyoto, the Russians would have done far better to avoid strong-arming Peking over Port Arthur, and thus at least maintain the fiction of a Chinese alliance. Even more problematically, the acquisition of Port Arthur left the Japanese apoplectic. It was one thing to bully them out of the area, but for Russia to then take the port for themselves was to rub Japan's nose in it. Muraviev was aware of the backlash his policy towards China and Port Arthur was bringing upon him from all directions, but stuck resolutely to it. Because the foreign minister had none of his predecessors' interest in Korea, he supposed he could win back Japanese goodwill by making concessions there. Specifically, he was willing to promise not to interfere in its domestic politics, and withdrew Russian military advisors. In sum, Muraviev had chosen to unwind almost all of the progress Russia had made in Korea since the Triple Intervention for the sake of Port Arthur. As Nish says, evidently Muraviev was pursuing his Port Arthur first policy and was prepared to sacrifice the forward policy in Korea to that end. For their part, the Japanese had begun to play with an idea that became known as Mankan-Kokan, Manchuria for Korea. On the 19th of March, the foreign minister, Nishi, handed the following note to the Russian minister in Tokyo. The Japanese government is not unwilling to conclude a self-restraining understanding with the Russian government, but the case may arise when Korea will need the advice and assistance of foreign countries. Accordingly, the Japanese government is of the opinion that the obligation of giving advice and assistance should most appropriately be borne by Japan. If the Russian government agrees with this view, the Japanese government will recognise Manchuria and its coastline as being beyond the sphere of Japan's interests. Muraviev may have inclined towards such an exchange, but this was a step too far for the Russian military, which opposed such a drastic retreat. And indeed, once Port Arthur was secured at the end of March, the Russians became rapidly less interested in talking Turkey over Korea. On the 2nd of April, the Russian minister in Tokyo, Rosen, told Nishi that while his government could not agree to exclude Russian power totally from Korea, it was delighted to hear that Japan considered Manchuria to lie outside her sphere of interest. Nishi apparently heard this reply with a wry smile. Basically then, Muraviev had been prepared to negotiate away Russian privileges in Korea when the Port Arthur lease was up in the air, and did make some firm concessions on this front, such as the withdrawal of military advisors. But once the lease had been secured, radical strategic changes, like leaving Korea to the Japanese in return for Manchuria, were quickly abandoned. The Japanese were thus left, if anything, even more annoyed than before. Their ambassador in London sent a memorandum suggesting the drastic course of an Anglo-Japanese alliance in response, a proposal rejected at this stage when it was discussed by the cabinet on the 2nd of April. Even if London would have agreed in 1898, which was doubtful, such an alliance would have meant signalling that Japan intended to act belligerently towards Russia. The Japanese, like the Chinese, did however practically fall over themselves to support a semi-reluctant British application for a lease on Weihaiwi once Japan had pulled its troops out after receiving the latest Chinese indemnity payment. Whilst Japan did not yet want the entanglements of a formal alliance, having the British in the region would provide a strong counterweight to Russia. For London was known for its desire to keep China open to trade, which implicitly meant helping to resist Russia in its mercantilist designs. Even so, the Japanese did not yet give up on bringing the Russians to the table, helped by the fact that Muraviev still wanted to avoid antagonizing them in Korea so as to focus on Manchuria. And later that month, these hopes seem to have been vindicated. The Nishi-Rosen Agreement, signed on the 25th of April 1898, was a landmark deal that stated, Japan and Russia confirm the sovereignty and complete independence of Korea, and agree to abstain from interfering in the internal affairs of that country. Japan and Russia, in the event Korea should request either Japan or Russia for counsel and assistance, shall not take any measure regarding the appointment of military instructors or financial advisors without having first arrived at a mutual understanding on the subject. Recognizing Japan's predominance in developing commercial and industrial enterprises in Korea, as well as the large number of her nationals residing in that country, the Imperial Russian government agrees not to obstruct the development of the commercial and industrial relations between Japan and Korea. It was certainly not a Russian withdrawal from Korea like Tokyo had initially hoped to orchestrate, but it did show there was still room for negotiation. Yet almost immediately the Russians made themselves appear two-faced in Japanese eyes. In August 1898, their conspiratorial and doggedly imperialist minister in Peking, Pavlov, was transferred to Seoul. There, he basically decided to ignore the Nishi-Rosen Protocol and the balance of power in the peninsula it enshrined. Instead, Pavlov began a new, relentless pursuit of privileges and concessions from a Korean government that still remained sympathetic to Russia for previous services rendered. At the end of 1898, then, the Japanese were distinctly on the back foot. The Chinese were likewise left in a difficult position. Aware that they were now being encroached on from all sides, they attempted to begin playing the various colonial powers off against each other. As we have seen, in the aftermath of the Russian and German port acquisitions, Peking quickly offered the British a lease of their own in an attempt to rope London into opposing Russian and German expansion. The main concern for all of the powers, though, was Russia's continued and increasingly aggressive concentration of power in Manchuria. The Americans were particularly worried, having recently extended their reach right into the Pacific via the acquisition of the Philippines. Washington wanted China open to her trade. The US feared that the great powers, and most importantly Russia, would instead impose a quasi-mercantilist regime within their spheres of influence, either locking out or at least disadvantaging American exporters. Thus, Washington developed what became known as the open door policy, the purpose of which was to keep China open to trade from all nations on an equal basis and prevent the empire's carve-up. In September 1899, the Secretary of State, Hay, circulated his now famous note to the great powers, urging them to commit to the principle of equal commercial opportunity within China, specifically by eliminating discriminatory trade practices. Given that the US itself had some of the highest tariff barriers in the world at this point, most of the great powers received this lecture with a raised eyebrow. Whilst the free-trading British naturally welcomed the idea, German and French replies were evasive. The Russians in particular were less than impressed with American opinion on the matter. They replied that whilst they had already shown their intention to follow an open-door policy by making Dalny a free port, they would not be bullied out of any of the privileges or commercial concessions they had won in Manchuria. Annoyingly for the Russians, the note meant America had publicly committed herself to maintaining China and thus Manchuria's territorial integrity. Not that America would ever be interested in standing up to Russia with more than words, but the principle was certainly frustrating. Thus, by 1899, Russia was clearly on the advance in the Far East, but she had kicked up a number of wasps' nests in her wake. The Chinese alliance was on skids, the Japanese thought them liars, and even the Americans were loudly complaining to anyone who would listen. Perhaps influenced by this, in the autumn of 1899, Muraviev prepared a memorandum for his colleagues which addressed the direction of Russian foreign policy. It covered everything from Russia's position in Europe, the Black Sea, Afghanistan, and the Far East. Although he generally advocated adopting forward policies in most areas given Britain's preoccupation with the South African War, in the Far East he argued against any more aggression until the Trans-Siberian Railway was completed. Russia's main focus should now be on securing the rail concessions through Manchuria and ensuring the connection of Port Arthur. By the turn of the century, Russian railways here were indeed making great progress. Port Arthur and Vladivostok were both developing rapidly, and Russian agents of all types were moving into the region. Having already upset so many other powers in acquiring these advantages, patience was now the best policy to avoid either overstretching Russian resources or antagonizing more powers. Once the Trans-Siberian was finished, the Russian hand in the region would be strengthened immeasurably, as she would be able to transfer reinforcements and supplies by land with substantially greater ease. This was all the more important because at sea, Russia's situation was increasingly unfavourable. The Japanese were embarking on a major naval armament program due for completion in 1902. Russia was attempting to do likewise, but the results were less than inspiring. The French naval attaché reviewing the fleet in 1896 was appalled by what he saw. The Empire's shipbuilding was weak and slow, as were the finished warships produced. Neither officers nor other personnel spent much time at sea, whilst drunkenness and loose discipline was endemic. The Navy did not have a strategic doctrine, and Russian officers were ignorant of rudimentary tactics. In 1897, Japan had a battle squadron of 22 vessels. The Russian Pacific Fleet had just 13 by contrast, without a single battleship. The Russian Navy predicted that by 1903, that is to say before the Trans-Siberian Railway would be fully operational, the Japanese fleet would comprise of 6 contemporary battleships, 1 old battleship, 6 armoured cruisers, and 19 cruisers of various types. There was much squabbling between the Navy and Witte over how to deal with this threat. Witte wanted to more or less ignore it, doubting that Japan had the financial capacity to support such a program in the long run. He was proved wrong. Although the Japanese ran deficits in this period and its economy was in depression conditions, the Chinese indemnity allowed them to fund their armament drive. Their new navy was also largely built in excellent British shipyards and thus was of much better quality than anything built domestically in Russia. The Russian navy was more alive to this threat than Witte. As far back as 1895, the Tsar's flag captain, Rear Admiral Lohman, had advocated maintaining a battleship fleet in the east, which would give us unconditional superiority over the Japanese. Given Japan's superior strategic position in the Far East, Makarov likewise later argued that the Tsar should target a 50% superiority over the Japanese fleet. Naturally, Nicholas struggled to make up his mind between the major shipbuilding expansion demanded by the Navy and Witte's penny pinching. In February 1898, he decided on a compromise, authorising a smaller programme than the Navy wanted. 5 battleships, 4 larger cruisers and 4 smaller cruisers, as it was decided a few months later. Importantly though, Nicholas also allowed Witte to skimp on costs by extending the completion date from 1903 to 1905. This was to be a disaster, as one historian puts it. In retrospect, Witte's insistence on the extension of the programme's duration to 1905 was fatal, as it resulted in the inferiority of the Russian Pacific Ocean Squadron in January 1904. Russia could intimidate Japan in 1895 through the raw size and prestige of its navy, but as the Japanese increasingly made themselves a peer power on the sea, it became even more essential that the Trans-Siberian Railway allowed the Russians to become overwhelming on land. On the eve of the Boxer Rebellion then, Russian ambitions in the east were unambitious in the short term. They had mostly grabbed what they wanted in the initial scramble for concessions in China, and in the long term there seemed little to prevent Manchuria and eventually Korea becoming protectorates of the empire. Britain, Japan and America had all made their opposition to further expansion clear, but this bloc was not yet a coherent or active one. True, the Japanese fleet was becoming a genuine threat, but if Russia moved cautiously until the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, there was no reason to necessarily think things needed to escalate. Muravyev's optimistic assessment, however, had not counted on how China was about to shake up relations. Since 1898, a series of incidents, which we might call peasant uprisings, targeting missionaries and foreign nationals, had been taking place throughout Chinese territory north of the Yangtze River. This Boxer Rebellion, as it was dubbed in the West, was the culmination of popular resentment at the heavy-handed foreign encroachment, mixed with misery caused by natural disasters over the previous decade. The revolt was generally allowed to run unchecked by the imperial court, who wanted to direct the violence away from themselves and onto foreigners. To begin with, Russia's main concern was that the Boxer Rebellion may bring about foreign intervention, which would possibly mean toppling the rule of the Empress Dowager and Li, widely assumed to still be Russian sympathisers and allies, even if they were dissatisfied with recent Russian advancements. The Russian minister in China, Ge, thus refused to join the diplomatic efforts of the other powers to pressure the Chinese government into suppressing the rebellion. Nonetheless, as Boxer violence converged on Peking, the Russian staff in the city joined the other European diplomatic missions in requesting protection from a joint expeditionary force. On the 13th of June, the Boxers entered Peking and began a siege against the legation quarter. The crisis was a serious danger for Russia, not helped when, on the 21st of June, Muravyev died, apparently having been lambasted by Witte the previous evening, who blamed the foreign minister for the situation with his seizure of Port Arthur. He was replaced by his deputy, Lambsdorff. The Russians now had little choice but to join the eight-nation Allied relief force, which arrived in August 1900 and fought its way to Peking to lift the siege. The attempted balancing act Russian policy was performing was put on display when, on the 25th of August, the Tsar announced his troops and legation would be withdrawn in a hope of still appeasing the Dowager Empress. Even if they were soon to be pulled out of China proper though, Russian troops were almost immediately re-engaged against the Boxers in Manchuria. Here, of course, was where Russia's real interests lay, where all of her investment, infrastructure and influence was concentrated. Boxer activity spread to Manchuria later than other Chinese regions, but it nonetheless caused consternation in St Petersburg when it did appear in the summer of 1900. Their attacks on Witte's beloved railways particularly horrified the finance minister, and meant he was willing to cough up the cash for large reinforcements. In July, the Russians invaded Manchuria, relieving Harbin from siege on the 2nd of August. By October, they had overrun most of the province, and the Boxers had largely gone to ground. Russia thus began a military occupation with almost 200,000 troops, and it quickly became apparent that the Russians were there for the foreseeable future. Britain, America and Japan, the open-door powers, once again protested yet more blatant Russian interference in the region, but there was little any could do. True, in Japan's case, their interest in Manchuria was not yet great, but a direct Russian occupation of the territory was naturally felt to be a threat to Japanese interests in Korea. Again, though the 1898 Nishi-Rosen Agreement theoretically guaranteed a balance of power, the Japanese were well aware that Russian agents still looked for opportunities to extend the Tsar's reach at Japan's expense, and parking a massive Russian army right next door hardly boded well in this regard. In truth, what little faith the Japanese still had in Russian honesty was rapidly evaporating. They felt they had tried for 5 years to secure an equitable settlement, and all it had culminated in was St Petersburg behaving even more aggressively in the area. For sure, this was a rather self-pitying assessment. It's hardly like Imperial Japan was known for behaving moderately when it held the military advantage. And indeed, with Japan's military build-up finally starting to bear fruit, it was at this point that the country began seriously contemplating military action. Certainly Tokyo was displaying a newfound confidence. The Russians were genuinely shocked when Japan took the lead in condemning their recent advances, something which they had never previously thought Tokyo capable of. The Russian invasion of Manchuria thus felt like a turning point for the Japanese. It no longer seemed likely that Japan could achieve her aims through negotiation, a suspicion Russia did nothing to alleviate over the following months. Russia would not allow Manchuria to be raised at the Peking conference, much to the Chinese's annoyance, as it meant they could not play the Russians off against the other powers over the issue. The Russians, particularly Witte, instead wanted to negotiate a bilateral agreement directly with China, which would legitimize their occupation. and a draft treaty that did just that was handed to the Chinese in February 1901. If accepted, it would have given Russia administrative and exclusive economic control over this part of China. Yet again, the open door powers objected, though the Chinese shrewdly noted they objected to Peking as a proxy rather than St Petersburg directly. As it was, the Russians cancelled the talks anyway after the Chinese refused to play ball. The Peking Protocol was signed on the 7th of September 1901 and Allied troops evacuated soon after. Russia had of course promised to do likewise in Manchuria as soon as normality returned to China, and there was now discussion in St Petersburg over how she should go about this. Nobody wanted to give up the almost total control over the territory that military occupation had brought, but nor was having half the world glaring daggers at you because of the occupation an enjoyable experience. Russia could simply negate their promise to evacuate by annexing Manchuria, as many within the militarist factions of St Petersburg wanted, but even for most hawks this was a step too far. Indeed, the Russian minister in Tokyo, Izvolsky, warned that Japan would go to war if this happened. Whilst the Russians continually underestimated Japanese military capabilities, neither the Tsar nor the Foreign Ministry wanted conflict if it could be avoided. Izvolsky instead argued for maintaining a partial occupation, which the Japanese would grow accustomed to in time. On the other hand, Witte campaigned for a return to the pre-Boxer status quo and a complete evacuation of Manchuria, with the exception of guards to protect the railways. This would ideally put the clock back and thus restore goodwill with the Japanese and the other great powers. First and foremost though, the Russians needed China to legitimise any action by agreeing to a treaty. As discussed, there was a reluctance on the Russian side to compromise to any extent, when there was always the option of riding out the world's displeasure and waiting for the Trans-Siberian Railway to finish in a few years. Yet in the meantime, the costs of supplying such a vast army in Manchuria began to mount, and Witte pressed ever more vigorously for a settlement. But things were further complicated by the death of Li Hungchang, China's most eminent statesman and something of a Russian sympathiser. He had been reluctantly prepared to grin and bear a Russian protectorate over Manchuria. Never again would there be anybody of his stature willing to advance the Russian cause in the Chinese court. Therefore, negotiations continued to stall. The result was that Witte's suspicions over what the occupation would do to relations with Japan were soon after confirmed. In February 1902, the Japanese embarked on a dramatic new course when they signed an alliance with Great Britain. Although the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne, did to the surprise of the Japanese say he was not opposed to them continuing to seek a settlement with Russia over Asia, the alliance was very clearly a Japanese break with St Petersburg. Support from the British Empire gave Japan the tools to contemplate more assertive action in Asia. The British would not, of course, actively partake in any Russo-Japanese conflict, except in exceptional circumstances. What they would do, however, is limit its spread. That is to say, Russia would never again be able to revive the coalition of the Triple Intervention so long as the British stood in their way. Germany and France had been happy to take easy pickings from Japan when she was isolated. They would not squabble with the Royal Navy for the sake of them. And indeed, Lambsdorff, when informed of the alliance, immediately recognised it as a major Russian diplomatic defeat. Still, the Japanese had not completely given up on a settlement with Russia, and having received London's blessing, continued to pursue this avenue. In August 1902, Lambsdorff said that Japan had offered a new agreement, where she would recognise Russian paramount interests in Manchuria if Russia did likewise for the Japanese interests in Korea. The proposal showed that the Japanese were now becoming much bolder in their negotiations, for where they had previously contented themselves to a balance of power in Korea and long-term encroachment, they were now asking to take de facto control of the peninsula. The situation on the ground certainly played to Japan's advantage, for whilst the Russians had been focused on Manchuria, Japanese commercial influence had greatly expanded in Korea. The Japanese government undoubtedly knew the Russians were unlikely to accept any type of swap, but that Japan was becoming more confident in its negotiating hand was obvious. In 1903, the Trans-Siberian Railway finally opened, though the facade quickly crumbled upon closer inspection. Some of the tunnels were still impassable and the track deficient in places. The clearest flaw was Lake Baikal though, which left an enormous break in the middle of the track, and work to correct it had been deferred for at least a year. The result was that the cost of maintaining the Manchurian occupation remained high, and Russian statesmen were increasingly desperate for a way to extract themselves from it. Negotiations, as we have already seen, were difficult though, for Russia naturally wanted to retain all the benefits of formal occupation while shedding the cost. Indeed, in the long term, Russian statesmen still explicitly looked to the annexation of Manchuria, but that was in the future. On the 8th of April 1902, after months and months of delays and failed negotiations, a draft agreement was finally concluded with the Chinese. It allowed for Russia to withdraw her troops over a 6-month period, whilst leaving a smaller guard to protect her railways and with some guarantees of her special interests, though the withdrawal was conditional on the vague promise that there would be no disturbances during this time, and Witte, once he had been sacked, claimed the government never had any intention of honouring the treaty in full. Nonetheless, Britain and Japan enthusiastically received it, and the door to re-establishing good relations with the latter seemed to have opened ajar once more. As even the most fraudulent of orthodox mystics could have predicted though, this brief period of optimism did not last. In the following year, Witte, having so long dominated the government and its eastern policy, saw his stock fall rapidly as recession continued to expose the defects of his once lauded economic policies. Into this power vacuum stepped A.M. Bezobrazov, an entrepreneur whose aggressive views on Manchuria and Korea were to become favoured by the Tsar over the following months. The evacuation from around Mukden in March and April 1903, in line with the new treaty, was a farce and only partially undertaken. When China refused a new set of demands in April meant to bind Russian influence in the region even tighter, St Petersburg decided to extend the occupation of northern Manchuria indefinitely. Yet this decision was not then conveyed to China or any other power. Indeed, when asked for Russian policy in the region, every minister seemed to give a different answer. Lambsdorff outright disassociated himself from the new demands that had been handed to China when questioned. Thus, Russian intentions remained a mystery, but one thing was clear: their troops remained in occupation of Manchuria. The Japanese, as usual, were relatively divided over how to proceed. A new naval expansion bill had just been steered through Parliament, and by 1903, Japanese opinion was undoubtedly more belligerent towards Russia than ever before. One memorandum from General Oguchi, circulated in June that year, openly set out the case for war. Russia's failure to complete the withdrawal of troops from Manchuria must give rise to grave alarm in Japan. Japan, together with Britain and the United States, should demand from Russia the open and public withdrawal of her troops. If Russia does not respond to our demands, Japan should achieve her objectives by armed force. The present is the most favourable time for this purpose, bearing in mind the superiority of our forces over Russia, the fact that the Trans-Siberian is incomplete, the existence of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the hostility of the Chinese people, etc. If we let today's favourable opportunity slip by, it will never come again. In sum, war seemed inevitable, and the sooner the better. This opinion was certainly not ubiquitous though, either in the military or civilian administrations. Indeed, General Oyama, to whom the memorandum was addressed, rejected its logic and maintained a Manchuria for Korea trade was still preferable. But a military solution was undoubtedly becoming favoured more and more among officers in the military. Still, the government was not yet ready for such drastic action. On the 23rd of June 1903, an imperial council held in the presence of the emperor instead came up with the following plan. In case Russia does not withdraw her forces from Manchuria in contravention of her promises, such a situation should be turned to Japan's advantage in order to resolve the Korean problem. In solving this Korean problem, Korea should be requested not to cede to Russia any part of her territory. In Manchuria, however, in view of the superior position already held by Russia, some concession to her may be allowed. This lent towards a Manchuria for Korea swap rather than belligerence. Yet, even if Japan was a far stronger power in 1903 than she had been at any previous point, the Russians remained unwilling to agree to such a renunciation of their interests in Korea. In fact, the newly influential Bezobrazov argued forcefully that Russia should not neglect the peninsula just because of her deepening interest in Manchuria. Bezobrazov's reputation in late imperial Russia is perhaps only surpassed by Rasputin's. He was a general who had made something of a name for himself on the empire's peripheries, and since retirement had dabbled in a range of money-making schemes. His influence over the Tsar was apparently real, but not overwhelming. As Nish says, sometimes he convinced the Tsar, sometimes he was sent on tour to get him out of the way. He was resented by Witte, Lambsdorff and Kuropatkin, who thought him vain, self-centered and difficult. Witte's power was on the wane though, and as a result the Tsar could now finally answer that bold question of, what if I put a useless charlatan in charge of my foreign policy? One such memorandum from Bezobrazov that reflects his views is as follows. Russia should demonstrate her energy and determination. Withdrawal of Russian forces from Manchuria is out of the question. A problem such as this concerns only Russia and China and should not be made a subject for international negotiations. Russia should increase her forces in the Far East with a view to silencing any opposition. She should construct defence works along the Yalu River with the object of forestalling a Japanese attack on Manchuria's flank and making it possible for her to threaten Japan from that region in case Japan attacks. Russia should discard Witte's timid policy, which will only lead her into difficulties. Real economic benefit should be obtained from the Far East. In Korea, it is possible for Russia to acquire further concessions. With the object of ending American support to Japan and attracting American sympathy for Russia, attempts should be made to become associated with American capital. In Manchuria, important industries should be controlled, but in order to soften the dissatisfaction of Americans and others, the open door should be observed there for foreigners. Perhaps part of the reason that Europe lost its expansionist drive is that the circumstances for men like Bezobrazov no longer exist. Once upon a time, you were required to put in the hard yards of running a logging company on the Yalu before anybody would listen to your awful geopolitical opinions. Now you merely need to create a diplomatic history YouTube channel to terrorize thousands with them. Russia could, according to Bezobrazov, apparently ignore everybody in Manchuria, extend its influence in Korea, but everything would be forgiven if she paid lip service to the open door, and thus attracted American capital or something. Yet it seems the Tsar did find this analysis at least superficially attractive. It of course did not help that Witte's policy of peaceful penetration had run into all sorts of difficulties, as we have seen, even if the man himself was not exactly to blame for many of them. Thus, on the 15th of May, Bezobrazov was appointed State Secretary and given endorsement of his timber ventures along the Yalu River. He was apparently convinced these would serve as a basis for a renewed Russian commercial and eventually military penetration of the Korean peninsula. Nicholas was impressed, Lambsdorff thought the whole idea ridiculous, and Witte was presumably off staring down the barrel of a shotgun somewhere. For the project was clearly guaranteed only to be a money sink and annoy the Japanese. That the Tsar was at least semi-serious about undertaking a more aggressive stance was revealed further in August 1903 by the appointment of Admiral Alexiev as Viceroy of the Far East, establishing a parallel chain of command that cut across both the war and foreign ministries. Alexiev had long been a leading advocate of a forward policy in the region, and his appointment was thus a clear signal that, far from moving cautiously until the Trans-Siberian was fully completed, as Muraviev had argued for several years earlier, the empire would instead act even more aggressively to secure her economic interests in Manchuria and Korea. Again though, if there is one thing you should take from this video about Russian policy in the lead up to the Japanese War, it's that there was so much of it there might as well have been none. For all the nightmares he induced in Witte and co, Bezobrazov's influence was on the wane by late summer 1903. His Yalu enterprises were, shock of shocks, failing financially, and he himself was ill and depressed, and forced to resign in September. As Nish says, his appearance at the front of the stage was an important and dramatic one, but it was short-lived. Basically then, as always, the story of Russia in the Far East remained one of confusion. Admiral Alexiev, briefly supported by Bezobrazov, advocated a forward policy. Lambsdorff, Witte and Kuropatkin campaigned for a more patient approach. The latter trio had certainly lost influence by late 1903, but then so had Bezobrazov. Alexiev remained in position, but the Admiral was unsure as to what exactly his title meant or what his prerogatives were. The one thing the role did clearly give him was the power to negotiate with neighbouring states, that is to say China and Japan. Thus, whatever else, Nicholas had put Russian relations in the Far East in the hands of the expansionist but diplomatically inexperienced Alexiev, just as another round of talks with Japan began. By the summer of 1903, the Japanese were taking the possibility of war very seriously. The Russians were not. Not out of pacifism, but a belief that despite Japan's growing strength, they would never actually risk a conflict with a great power. And for sure the Japanese, like the Russians, had their own moderate surge in compromise. Factional infighting in both governments, though, made any sort of compromise difficult. Instead, both began reinforcing their armaments in the region. Manchuria in particular remained a major sticking point, for the Russian occupation continued with no end in sight. Admiral Alexiev broke off negotiations with China in one of his first actions as viceroy, and Sino-Russian relations, once so close, fell to a new low. Certainly most powers now doubted Russia had ever had any intention of completely evacuating Manchuria despite their obligations to do so. It's important to remember that the treaty was the nearest thing to international law there was at this point. Indeed, in many respects, it was more sacred to the European concert. Breaking a treaty was immensely frowned upon, not only because of its impact on national reputation and prestige, but also because of such an act's association with Bonaparte's profligacy in that regard. Thus, as Paul Schroeder notes, Britain could claim not to have broken a single treaty in Europe between 1815 and 1914. Russia had a less stellar history in this regard, yet even she only broke a European treaty occasionally, and thus the almost casual flippancy with which St Petersburg regarded its Far Eastern obligations left a bitter taste in Japanese mouths. On the 12th of August 1903, the Japanese handed the Russians new terms that would have basically turned Korea into a protectorate if accepted. The Russians countered that Korea should not be used for military purposes and free passage of the straits assured. In that case, Russia would recognise Japan's position in South Korea, provided that everything past the 39th parallel became a neutral zone. Manchuria was to be entirely outside of Japan's sphere of interest. As should have been expected by this point, the negotiations went nowhere. Japan was prepared to see a small neutral zone along the Korean-Manchurian border, but wanted her own treaty rights in Manchuria also guaranteeing, something the Russians absolutely refused to be drawn into formally accepting. The desire to make Manchuria part of the negotiations was another indicator of Japan's growing confidence in its position. Previously, she would have probably taken a Manchuria for Korea swap. Now Tokyo was demanding formal recognition of its influence within the province Russia had had so much trouble with. By the first week of December, foreign observers were predicting war, though the Russian minister, Rosen, still thought extremist opinion in Tokyo could be held in check. Alexiev seems to have also convinced himself that Japan would never actually fight, and so he could dig in his heels if necessary and drag out negotiations. The Russians were of course aware that within a year the Baikal route of the Trans-Siberian Railway would be finished, whilst the delayed shipbuilding program would also be completed, with 5 new Borodino-class battleships coming online, thus giving Russia naval supremacy. The Japanese naturally also knew this, and so made the calculation that if they were going to go, it had to be now. On the 16th of December, the Japanese told the Russians that there were no concessions they were prepared to make, and that Manchuria had to be involved in the negotiations. Although a final set of counter-proposals were delivered on the 21st of December to Russia, military preparations were now underway in earnest in Japan. A few days later, they asked Britain for a significant loan for war purposes, something London in due course declined, not actually wanting to see a conflict in the region. Whitehall would not, however, get in Japan's way and would still work to keep any war localised, that is to say France and her Pacific Squadron, firmly out of it. Japan likewise decided that it would not look to form an alliance with China. This was something Peking had been hinting at, having decided that a Japanese victory was their best chance of recovering Manchuria. If nothing else, it showed how abysmally low Russian stock had fallen in China. Instead, the Japanese decided to limit the conflict to just them and Russia. At this point, Alexiev had finally realised conflict was coming and repeatedly appealed to the Tsar to authorise partial mobilisation of Russian military forces in the Far East. Back in St Petersburg though, Lambsdorff and most other interested ministers remained inclined to some 11th-hour compromise, overriding Alexiev's belligerency. There was general agreement that time was on Russia's side and nothing drastic should be done. Again though, the Russian government was too chaotic and too jealous to ever come up with something like a workable set of new proposals quickly. It was all too little, too late. The Japanese were becoming firmer by the day in their resolve. Even Russian sympathisers in the cabinet were despairing at the possibility of any settlement with them. All that really remained at the beginning of 1904 was the Navy's opposition. For all Russia's blundering, the Japanese Navy felt it did not have an overwhelming advantage. In January, the Russian Pacific Squadron consisted of 7 battleships, 4 armoured cruisers, 7 protected cruisers, and 27 destroyers. Japan's fleet consisted of 6 battleships, 8 armoured cruisers, 12 protected cruisers, and 27 destroyers. Japan thus had a slight numerical edge in battleships and armoured cruisers combined. Their ships were also modern with homogeneous technical characteristics, whereas Russia's ships were a mix of older and modern ships with diverse technical elements, many of which were inferior to the Japanese. Additionally, Japan's destroyers were faster and more modern, whilst Japan's training had been far superior for many years. Still, as control of the seas was utterly essential to any Japanese success, the margin was a bit too close for the Navy's liking. They had thus purchased 2 Argentine cruisers in Genoa on the 9th of January and were waiting for them to reach the South China Sea before opening hostilities. The ships eventually arrived in Japan on the 16th of February. Thus, the final last-minute negotiations between the 6th of January and the outbreak of war on the 10th of February were little more than a stage play, mainly to give both powers time to prepare. Again, it's worth noting that once the 5 modern Borodino battleships had been completed, Russia would have had naval supremacy again. The Chinese indemnity had been exhausted, and Japan would not be able to compete in any future naval arms race. If the Japanese were going to fight, their window was 1904, and that was it. On the 12th of January, an imperial conference was held to study the latest Russian response from a few days earlier. A resolution passed by the conference summed up Japanese thinking. Russia had made no adequate concession over Korea and had even refused to enter into negotiations over Manchuria, while she was at the same time trying to build up her military strength there. The council was apparently unanimous that military action was now inevitable. It was thus decided a final ultimatum would be sent, albeit one without a strict deadline so as to give the Navy time to finalise its preparations. On the 25th of January, the Russians said that they would refer Japanese terms to a special conference, but this would inevitably mean a delay that the Japanese were likely to be ill-disposed to. The Russians basically still seemed blasé about the threat, almost continuing to treat Japan as if it were some minor African kingdom. Indeed, Rosen apparently said his country need only mobilise 1 division for the Japanese to climb down. On the 28th, a conference was held to discuss the final Japanese terms, where it was agreed to again ignore Manchuria and restate the need for a Japanese guarantee not to use Korea for strategic purposes. On the 30th of January, the Japanese decided the Russians were merely attempting to buy time, and the final descent to war began. The Japanese embassy in Petersburg broke off talks on the 6th of February. On the 8th of February, the Japanese fleet launched a surprise attack on Port Arthur. 3 hours later, Japan declared war on Russia. The reason the Russo-Japanese War broke out is not a particularly complicated one. True, there are debates over whether it was really Korea or Manchuria the Japanese were after, but basically the story was one of the Japanese feeling they were entitled to be treated like a great power and Russia feeling they weren't. Had the Russians retained the capacity of 1895 and the ability to swat the Japanese like a fly in any fight, no one could really have criticised them for doing so. But they did not. Once Russia had failed to use the triple intervention to cripple the Japanese military build-up by confiscating the Chinese indemnity, it was obvious a deal was going to have to be cut with them at some point. The country was too populous, too powerful, too ambitious to ignore. If Russia had pursued a settlement with any kind of coherence or realism at any stage, they could still have achieved one overwhelmingly favourable to their interests. Whilst the Japanese grew more confident as the years went by, they remained aware of their weaknesses right up until the outbreak of war. It was the chaotic, incoherent nature of Russian foreign policy that scuppered any chance of this. If asked, could you name who was genuinely in control of Russian foreign policy throughout the decade? Witte, then Muraviev, then Witte again, then Nicholas, then Rosen, then Pavlov, then Witte, then Bezobrazov, then Lambsdorff, then Alexiev, with the idiot ball bouncing between them all. All foreign ministries had their own quirks, their own competing centres of power. Very few behaved quite so incoherently as Russia's when it came to the Far East. From a position of leading an international coalition that kept Japan weak, the British out, and the Chinese overwhelmingly in Russia's debt, in the course of a decade this had been reversed. By 1904, Russia was instead an international pariah in Asia, seen to have consistently defied the open door powers through its behaviour in Manchuria. The Japanese had gone from willing to settle to irreversibly hostile and newly powerful with a British alliance, whilst Russia's own friendship with China was dead and buried. The Russians could still have won the conflict, indeed it took some genuine bad luck, like the tenacious Admiral Marikov's death, for them to lose, but that they allowed the war to happen in the first place was an entirely avoidable mistake.